This is a KCB104 Media and Communications Industries podcast. Ruben Foster here in the QUT radio studios in the Creative Industries Precinct, and we're very lucky to be joined by distinguished Professor Stuart Cunningham. He's the Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Creative Industries and Innovation. Thank you so much for being here, Stuart.
That's okay, Ruben. Thank you very much for having me.
And also a contributor to our textbook as well. So, again, very lucky. Look, I want to ask you a very complicated question to begin with straight away, Stuart. What is a media company now in this era?
Well, yes, what is a media company? That's one of the kinds of questions we ask at the start of the textbook, don't we? Like, what are other media today? And I suppose the reason for asking such a self-evident or obvious question is that it's not self-evident or obvious, because I suppose underneath the real mover here is the phenomenon of convergence. And what convergence is doing is that it's making computer companies, telecommunications companies, internet service providers, even sports bodies. I mean, the AFL, the Australian Football League, are media companies. They're producing content, they're disseminating content, they're interacting with traditional media companies. So this is a really fast-moving phenomenon, this phenomenon of convergence, and as I hope that you will, emphasise in class, that there was a major review of convergence in Australia, 2011, 2012, the so-called Convergence Review, and what the Convergence Review showed was that the gap between the regulatory frameworks that are based on traditional distinctions between media, broadcasting, telecommunications and ICT, information and communications technologies, the gap between those regulations and the industry realities that we face today on almost a kind of monthly change basis are widening. So what is a media company now, or who is a media company now? Well, you got to go and actually find out what's on the ground, because it's not going to, 5 years ago, you wouldn't have a lot of the realities we have today.
Well, in your personal opinion, Stuart, who interests you or excites you most as a media enterprise today?
Well, I think that it's really good to look at both the very local and the very global. To me, some of the most exciting local activities here in Brisbane, you'd have to say that Hoodlum, the transmedia company that has a really innovative track record, and I mean that from not only a domestic, that is national point of view, but also international point of view, has been one of the real trailblazers in transmedia and multi-platform content production for television, but also, of course, as the name implies, multi-platform for a whole range of other platforms. Hoodlum's gone from strength to strength, starting with little programs like Fat Cow Motel, webisode style productions at a time when no one really even knew what a webisode was. They were inventing the category, and they've gone from strength to strength. Their Secrets and Lies television and multi-platform program released in prime time on 10 this year, is now in production as a US franchise. They have international awards for all of their web work on such programs as Spooks and Emmerdale Farm. This is a Brisbane-based company with a really proud track record of global innovation. And Halfbrick are a company in the game space that had a fantastic success with Fruit Ninja, and is now really exploring the links between social media, games, apps for games, and television. So there are some fantastic There's fantastically innovative local companies. But at a global level, there's the whole broad area where a whole new media ecology has emerged in the last few years. By that I'm talking about what a book I've done with John Silver called Screen Distribution and the New King Kongs of the Online World. That's meant to take up the great Hollywood adage, content is king. Well, if content is king, distribution is King Kong. And our argument is that the new digital platforms, principally Google, YouTube, but also Vivo, Amazon Prime, and Facebook, Hulu, Yahoo, Apple, iTunes, are all at different rates and with different levels of commitment. But certainly with YouTube, Amazon Prime, and Vivo, really getting into commissioning of content, providing television-like services in a whole variety of ways. And of course Netflix, which calls itself the world's leading internet television company. And how long will it be where they just drop the term internet from there and call themselves the world's leading television company? You've got an incredible explosion of globally significant new media production and distribution. The multi-channel networks that are feeding YouTube and the other platforms, the opportunities for non-US production into these global, these new supply chains is really interesting, and it's something that's really occupying my research time at the moment, because I think it has real implications for the ways in which new production forms and new producers will emerge in this country as well as elsewhere.
So then, given that the huge broad definition of media now, should the traditional media, such as broadcasters, still be considered special in terms of regulation?
Well, my position on this is that there's absolutely no immediate threat that I know of politically to the arguments for the specialness of media. Now, the specialness of media the arguments for it have been based on the idea that it's culturally important to have Australian voices. And this is, I think, undiminished as an argument, particularly as more and more global content becomes available. So the cultural argument hasn't changed. In fact, I think it's got stronger. And the social argument is that the social impact of media is such that it cannot and should not stray too far from community standards, however you want to define those. So there's a cultural argument and there's a social argument for the specialness of media. And if we remember the Convergence Review from just a year and a half ago, it was charged with charting a pathway towards a more deregulatory future, but it argued that those two principles should remain inviolate. They should not change, and I would agree with that. I think we should remain extremely comfortable with the argument that broadcasting remains essentially a mass medium. It can still aggregate viewerships and listenerships at a given point in time more efficiently than any other media, and for that reason those cultural and social arguments still obtain, in my view.
So on the cultural and social requirements or the way that the traditional broadcasters contribute to that, is it important for us to have those Australian content requirements for new media?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is an important question. I think that it's important to continue to look at that question. The question of just pose the question to me again, if you could.
Do you think it's important for Australian content requirements to be placed on new media, new electronic media?
Well, again, I would refer students in the class to the Convergence Review, where a very interesting scenario was outlined. New media providers like Apple or like Google in this country are becoming more and more significant providers of content. When they reach a certain threshold, and as the traditional media decline somewhat further over time in terms of the viewerships that they might be able to generate, when there's crossovers there, when there's a crossover with the amount of content accessed via these two different forms, the so-called new media and the old media, then you get a trigger point where what the Convergence Review called content services enterprises. In other words, whether you be new media or old media, you're a content services enterprise. You deliver content, you produce and deliver content to viewers, that they become uniformly regulated. Now, that to me seems a reasonable position, and nothing that I've seen since that proposal has come up with a better argument about the ways in which new and old media might continue to be regulated in this rapidly changing environment.
Stuart, I want to ask you about the fact that Australia is such a huge importer of content.
Yes.
Is this going to be a problem, or is it currently a problem?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that Australia is a very major importer of media content. The so-called trade deficit is very large. It always has been. The second thing to say is that Australia is absolutely no Robinson Crusoe in that any country that has a reasonably open trading relationship with Hollywood film and television is a net importer of content, simply because of the sheer power and volume and marketing strength of that content around the world. Now, that's not true of all places in the world by any means, but any country with a reasonably open trading relationship with US film and television are net importers. So why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem for the traditional cultural nationalist argument, and that's been around for probably almost 100 years. So there are still serious questions about the need for Australian culture and identity to be asserted, to be found, to be able to be viewed, to be able to be consumed. And the fact that we're a major net importer of content remains an issue for that reason. But it's also in the new environment of how significant are the creative industries more generally, of which film and television is part, a significant or serious industry. It's hard to make the argument that it's a serious industry when it has this endemic balance of payment problem, balance of trade problem, which is it's a net importer of content. Now, having said that, if you look at the whole of the creative industries, probably the only net exporter is architecture of that series of sectors called the creative industries. Film, television, music and games are all major net importers. So it's hard to make the argument that it's a serious industry with real growth potential if it's not exporting in a significant way. In our research, we've been able to show that domestically speaking, that is within the Australian economy, it's a significant sector, and that it is a great utiliser of human capital. In other words, it's a labour-intensive sector that is, and that's important. But it's been hard to say the creative sector is a major new sector that deserves high-level attention from policymakers because of this problem that it is a a big net importer of content. So that's why it is significant. That question is significant.
Stuart, when we first started talking, you mentioned Hulum, the Brisbane company. Do we have any other promising strengths as exports in our media industries?
Well, are you you're talking about the whole country? Well, look, globalization and convergence are changing the nature of media. That's a pretty bald but basically true statement. What we're going to find going forward is that successful companies are going to be far more plugged into international viewerships, consumption bases than they have been before. In the old days of traditional media, which is still predominantly the case today, you may have a domestically supported production, through government subsidy and private investment. It's made, it's shown on Australian television. It garners some interest in public, support through ratings, and then an international buyer, may buy that completed production in one of the markets, one of the television markets around the world. Now, that's a very elongated process by which you get export. I think that we'll see a lot more, and these days you are seeing a lot more of international companies based in Australia or having very strong intelligence about the Australian production capability and investing in it or coming in at a much earlier stage, or that it's being made for a global platform in the way that I described the new media ecology, the so-called King Kongs of the online world. What that is doing is people are making content, as yet for very small amounts of money, but they will grow. Making content for already global platforms, or relatively global, much more than domestic platforms. So we'll see that pattern of international presence in the Australian market and making product directly for global platforms will continue to change quite significantly, I think, the nature of export success in the audiovisual industries.
Stuart, thank you very much for coming and sharing your insights with our students.
Well, thank you very much, Ruben and Avijit, for the opportunity. I hope that this is a really interesting. I hope it's interesting to your students. Thank you.